Hello, friends. Welcome to Season 2 of the Club podcast. Each week, we bring you long-form conversations with the people building at the edges of crypto and community. At Seed Club, we believe in a world where people, not platforms, capture the value created online, and where community-owned networks are some of the most valuable organizations in the world. Join us for a front row seat to the latest insights and tactical learnings at the intersection of crypto and community. Today we're joined by Ben Jacobs, who was one of our earliest contributors here at Seed Club. Ben and I spent a bunch of time talking about his inception and involvement in Seed Club. We talk about some of the big lessons that we've learned. We talk about some of our contrarian points of view. I think this one just feels like a conversation that Ben and I would often have, which is trying to create space to broadly make sense of the world that we're operating in. I hope you find value in it. Let's jump into it. Well, Ben, welcome to Club.
Let's do it. I'm excited to be here.
I'm trying to think about the last year and a bit has been a little bit of a haze for me, but thinking back to our earliest touch point, which was your application to Seed Club's second cohort, I think.
Yeah.
Why don't you just give folks who maybe don't know you a brief introduction?
Thanks, Jess, for having me. What's up? I'm Ben. I'm from New York originally, and I've been involved in investing in the crypto space for a long time. Don't come from a technical background, don't come from a finance background, never really knew where I could participate in the asset class, but I was always excited by it, interested in participating in any way I could. And then in 2020, I started reading about DeFi, participating in DeFi, and DeFi led to Web3 and NFTs. And at that point in time, I started writing a Substack called Benny for My Thoughts. And I started to kind of learn about what was going on with these experiments with Alex Coin and Jam, and seeing what was going on with Connie Digital. And I got excited by it. And through that process, I was thinking of launching a social token for my Substack. And I started reaching out to people who seemed smart on the space. And I got connected with James Duncan and Ruben, and all roads pointed to that tall guy. And so I finally got in touch with that tall guy, Jess, the bearded man.
That's me.
And had a conversation with him, and Jess basically shut down the idea of me launching a social token for my Substack, basically saying that all early indicators of experiments in the space had suggested that that strategy wouldn't work. And rather, there were early indications that what Seed Club was doing in that communities with their own tokens had some real green shoots. And so through that process, Jess and I just started jamming, and ultimately I just started raising my hand, trying to help out. And over the months, continued to try and support Jess and the cohort that was live, and over time became one of the core contributors at Seed Club. So it's been an excellent ride. It's amazing that how much has happened, both broader crypto, the overall macro environment, but specifically zooming in on Seed Club, the evolution has been incredible to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to think back to some of those early experiments, because I think we had the way you framed it there was I was pretty clear about thinking that the way that most people were thinking about social tokens at the time, I thought were not going to be the enduring, interesting piece. And I think that was a lot of early experiments. We had Brian on last week talking about, actually, I don't even think we talked about the Jam token, but that was sort of an early example. And Alex doing slowly sort of personal tokens, and I think more creator coins, I guess it might be the way to describe it, as a solo creator entering into the space and looking for ways of maybe improving economics, or doing many of the things that we think communities are able to do now with tokens, but in a way that I think has proven to be not as enduring, appealing, or value additive over time. We've seen a really big shift away from, I think, two things. One, creator coins generally representing an individual creator, though there's still a lot of people taking swings at that, so I don't think that is necessarily out of the realm of possibility of working. But then two, this idea of designing micro economies. Do you listen to the All In podcast at all? All In podcast, right? And listen to Jason talk about coins and everybody's coin. It's the most boomer thing ever, but it also sort of, tokens, coins, there's a meaningful difference between those two. And it sort of goes right back to this idea of are these tokens that represent sort of a governance and membership in something, or are they designed to be like money, right? This medium of exchange. And this is a debate that goes back as far as, crypto goes back. The original intent of Bitcoin was to be a P2P currency, and And you could argue that's definitely not the case for that today. So I wonder, how is your view on where the opportunity is in this, let's just say, social token broad category space change since your earliest days of interest?
Yeah, what drew me to this area of crypto and what I'm sure, many of the people who are listening to this podcast are interested in is the experiments. It's like there's so much complexity, so much nuance in designing an economy with a token, whether it's an NFT or an ERC20 as a circuitry within that community. It's immensely complex and no one has the answers. And what I loved about this weird area of the internet was that no one was afraid to experiment, tinker, have an audacious idea and actually go after it. And to me, selfishly, I was like, wow, not only am I like sitting on the cutting edge of crypto, chatting with the smartest people out there who are experimenting, but I'm also learning about all these different industries and challenges and how Web3 rails and tools are going to disintermediate them. And so for now, the early inklings were like, this is going to the creator economy, the passion economy, what Lee Jin always talks about. Like, how will tokens and Web3 tech unlock new capabilities for these people? But then zooming out from that and looking at other use cases is like investment DAOs and specifically grants and allocation to new challenges. And like, I see this new vertical of decentralized science being fascinating and leveraging that same functionality, but tackling a totally different industry. So the same tooling that is helping Kraus House go out and, accomplish this Mount Everest of trying to buy an NBA team, that same tooling is being used to, start a wine club or to start a decentralized science DAO. And those experiments is part of what it really excites me, because I feel like I'm learning about all these different industries under the same roof of Web3 tech.
The original insight around Seed Club was really that, right? Like how do we learn faster as a group, right? Like how do we be in more experiments? How do we start to aggregate those insights? And I think what's been shocking to me is just how far and wide those possibilities have gone over the last year, really. But I think like to think that we would be playing in the decentralized science space alongside DAO-owned IP, alongside social clubs, alongside headless brands and bands and all alike, I think it's just quite fascinating. But it also leads to this challenge of like, how do we start to contextualize this space a little bit, right? There's, this broad challenge of communicating what the there is in Web3. And I think this has been a point of conversation quite a bit in the space over the last little while of trying to articulate, like, why would people want to go build on these rails? Yeah, I'm curious what your sort of take is on like, what's there in Web3? Why does this stuff matter?
I've noticed there's been challenges to those in crypto to really think through what are the use cases. What is going on here that people are so fervent? And I think that's what makes this bear market kind of exciting, is those who are just here to make money. There's no money to be made right now. So there's no reason for those people to really spend time in the asset class. Those who are still around building, breathing this stuff, talking about it, are in there for a real reason, that they think it's going to make the world better in some capacity, or that it's a leg up over what it already exists. So I look around and I think we're still in the early days of DAOs and communities having the precedents and the tools and everything necessary in order to operate an organization at the same speed and efficiency as a traditional corporate would. I think that the use cases are still under development and we don't have clear winners yet in this area of crypto. I think we're seeing things like Helium be a real world example. I think we're seeing obviously the protocol layer and DeFi like demonstrating real adoption, and NFTs just from an art perspective. But we're now seeing with LinksDAO and with Pool Suite examples of NFTs unlocking membership and access and token gated content and areas for those who meet a certain criteria, meaning they have an NFT or they have a social token, can vote on things or can get access to special areas. I find those are like the early green shoots that we're seeing of adoption and innovation start to kind of stick. But I'm really bullish, and like this is a thesis I'm trying to refine in my head, is like communities are almost like applications built on top of the Ethereum protocol. And like each community is solving a problem and it's leveraging this tech to go out and solve this problem. And so you look at all the projects that pass through Seed Club, but even looking beyond it, like Constitution DAO, like leverage this tooling to go and solve a real problem, trying to bid on a real world, very valuable artifact. I think that's like an example of people coalescing on the internet to co-own something that rapidly, leveraging software that was developed in the last 12 months is pretty crazy. And I think everyone gets so sucked up on the never ending now of crypto. But you zoom out, you look at what's being built in the last 12 months, it's phenomenal. I was reading Packy's Not Boring, and he cited this Electric Capital post where there are fewer Web3 total developers than there are developers just at Google or Meta alone. So like it's still early. And I find that fascinating that like there's not that much tech talent even yet working on this full time.
And yet it feels like this whole wave of tech talent has just come in, and compared to where we were 2 years ago, it's just fascinating.
Yeah, and I'd flip that to you. Like, what are you most excited about, like real world use cases, impact? I know we believe that this is the future and like that's the truth, but like where are you seeing like key use cases that are available now? And like, what do you think those use cases will look like in a year, and will they be different?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the challenge in the space is that so many folks have an incentive to very much overpromise and underdeliver. Like that's probably the best way to describe 2017, the ICO boom. And I think that's very fair of this last one in different ways. And people fail to clearly articulate just how new and nascent all this stuff is. And I think people, there's this 40, 50 years of development that went into the internet before anybody really gave a shit about it. And tokens and speculation give us a reason to pay attention a lot earlier and create a false narrative around how advanced we are. And so, I look at a project like Step In and you see like, I mean, the number of pitches we get right now that are like research to earn or create to, I'm like, this is literally work. This is not, you're not inventing anything new, but we're just trying to be too fancy around a bunch of things. And I think that was the same sort of insight we had early on around folks that are trying to build community tokens that are economies and have worried about velocity of how the token's moving from different members and all this sort of complexity that exists there that is just like far more complicated than I think it truly really needs to be. I think right now the best use cases are tokens represent ownership in digital networks. And some of those networks are going to be really valuable for a number of different reasons. I don't know what the value of those things should be. I don't know if they're overvalued, undervalued, but we do not have good structures in the traditional legal world to represent ownership in networks that do not lead to immense concentration of power and to, like the negative impacts that networks that reach scale like Facebook and Twitter, the incentives they have to really start to extract value rather than create value. And so I think that alone, that simple idea of tokens being a governance or an ownership stake in a network is absolutely groundbreaking. And when we start to sort of take that and think about, well, the world that we're really interested in and think about communities, communities often behave very much like networks. They have different dynamics to them for sure, but that sort of expansion beyond just like base layer infrastructure and into applications and into communities themselves, I think is just really interesting. And so I think like some of the most interesting pieces are these NFT collections that allow people to sort of share incentive in promoting something. Like, as you know, I'm a big fan of the Chromie Squiggle, watching the dynamics of collectors and the different organizations that have stakes in them there and all sort of aligned in wanting to make this thing be more prevalent in the world and, ultimately have that reflected in the value of the token, I think is fascinating. I think Brian, who's on recently, is talking a lot about scaling DAOs and saying like DAOs that have less than 50 people in them are just country clubs. And I'm like, country clubs are like a great business model. And this idea of representing an ownership stake in a country club that is out there to help you build your career or to help publish a book or to help bring a new story world to life, I think those are really fascinating. And, people spend a lot of money to go join country clubs because it improves their careers or improves their access to local community or any number of these things. So I don't think there needs to be like an immense overthinking. Tokens represent membership or governance or ownership in a network. Those networks can be extremely complex, like Ethereum and Bitcoin or Solana. They can be very simple, like holding one of 2,500 Pool Suite executive cards such that you can go to parties and get access to all the fun things that are coming out of that ecosystem. to holding a Bored Ape that is, well, I guess getting you ridiculed on the streets of New York right now. But I think that's where we're at right now.
And I think everyone ascribes like a use case to being like, oh, it's generating cash flows, or it's creating like a real dollar value. But I think there is indirect utility that we've kind of discovered through like the leveraging of this tech. Just being able to pop around, and not saying that this is a good thing to do, but just to be popping around all these different products, but to like get a peek underneath the hood in what's being built in public, and to actually be able to join. And even if you want to go support a single DAO for a month, I used to work at Bird Scooters. If I wanted to go work at Uber for a month to understand how they do certain different elements of their business, or how they're thinking about rider growth or marketing, that's unbelievably fascinating. So our collective intelligence by all working in public and being able to tap into these different communities, and it's very positive sum. It doesn't feel competitive in that you could be a member of different communities. I think that's like a revelation in of itself. And I think that's why people are so fervent about this space. Like, it is weird if you think about it. Like, in all my jobs previous to this, it was a clear job. And I think many people who are in crypto would feel the same. Like, it doesn't really feel like a job, and it becomes almost like a way of life. It gets like intertwined in your DNA. And I think it's just because we realize like all this like subliminal, indirect progress that's being made that isn't necessarily a use case in quotes, because like it's not tactical value. But I think that will come as a result of the speed of experiments, the speed of incremental intelligence and collective intelligence. I think it's kind of a foolish question to go after given how early we are in this technical journey.
Yeah, I like to say that C Club is a sense-making network. And I think so many people join, and to this day I have phone calls with folks that are, maybe investors or running innovation departments at different corporations that are excited. They want to sort of have a peek under the hood as to what's happening at C Club and in our broader communities. And Nicole, in the previous life, was very involved in the MIT Media Lab. And that is the business model of the Media Lab, is basically like, hey, you come and support us over here with grants or with sponsorships, and you're going to get a first look at all the cool, crazy experiments that are happening here. That just starts to scale more internationally and maybe be a little bit more accessible and more valuable to, say, individuals like you and I. One of the other big shifts that I think we've seen in crypto is folks have access to be able to participate in these projects at the earliest stages in ways that traditionally, either from geography or other limitations, they're unable to. And so now anybody can be a VC, anybody can be a hedge fund manager, anybody can be a contributor, and it just changes the dynamics there quite a bit and expands the addressable market, I think, for that interest. But I do think there is sort of this, for many people who are skeptics, are earnestly trying to learn. I think like the criticism around like, where does value actually flow in here? And like, are these things actually better than what Web 2 projects might be like? And I think, you see Adam Levine and all these guys that are made their bag in Web 2 being very critical of Web 3, which very much reminds me of the Bill Gates or the Web 1 guys poking fun at the internet back in the early days. But I think there are earnest explorers that are trying to say like, okay, well, like what needs to exist for this to truly be transformational? And I think one of those pieces is moving beyond just this purely speculative driven hype that I think we've seen consistently, grow the crypto space, but also lead to this massive volatility, to something that does have much more of like a, whether it's discounted cash flow value or some other like measurable value that can give confidence to either larger investors or more investors. You and I, a lot of our conversations end up to be talking about, I'd say, like the business side of DAOs. How do you think about stewarding cash, managing your token, thinking about how value flows within these networks? What do you sort of think needs to be different for organizations that are evolving through this current market or ones that are launching as we sort of approach our fifth cohort?
Yeah. One thing I find novel about people entering crypto is that they come from an investment perspective first. Then they start to uncover different areas within the asset class to participate in, whether it's a DAO or a community, or they start buying NFTs, whatever it may be. But they initially come in most likely because they wanted to make money. Someone told them, you got to buy this NFT project, or you should buy this token, or whatever it may be. Like, I'm going to speculate on Doge. I find that's different versus in the normal VC Web 2 world, you would join like an exciting company, partially because you think there's long-term financial upside, but mainly you're inspired by the mission, and like you used a bird scooter and you thought it was great. And so you wanted to join bird scooters because you thought it was a leapfrog in last mile mobility. But I think going forward, what we'll start to see is that blockchains and the complexity of the tech will get abstracted away, and people will join and be leveraging crypto without even knowing they're using it. And I think that's going to come in via games. That'll come in with like purchasing an NFT to go to a concert or something like that. And so there will be crypto rails underneath real world experiences. And I'm excited for those real world applications to come to fruition and kind of propel us into the next bull market. What I find fascinating now is going back to just where we sit within the market. And Chris Berninsky talks about it. It's like there is that loyalty of like suffering together and like sticking and being frugal. And like whenever you hear like a success story of like an entrepreneur on how I built this, they're always like, yeah, I was like eating dinner off cardboard boxes and I had pizza 50 nights in a row. You know, like that's like the most memorable part of their journey. It's like when they were at this like total trough in excitement and like very few people were there, but those who were trudging through it, if they escape to the end, and I'm not saying everyone will and very few will, but like that is like the glorious part of it. And so I think like that's when you like really got to buckle up and like revel in this exciting moment. That's like, this is the moment that those memories will form, those allegiances and bonds will form. And so I think the smartest projects are just realizing that this is a time to be frugal. This is a time to really focus on like the core of what you're building, to onboard people who are like truly driven by the mission. And like one counter thought I think I have is I love the idea of communities bridging people over who've never bought any crypto, who don't care about crypto, who might even hate it, but they like the mission, like they love wine or food or whatever. And so you're a crypto food DAO and you're going to bring over this food critic who hates crypto, but he loves food. And like, you're going to be the one to set him up with the MetaMask. You're going to provide the high touch, white glove experience because no one ever forgets who first brought them into crypto. You always remember that moment, that person who spent the time. And so I think like those doing things that don't scale and trudging through these challenging times is, I think, what's going to build momentum in this bear market, and that will explode in the next bull market.
You know, interesting to think how much quieter everything was in end of summer, early fall 2020. And just the benefits that come from starting and being a part of something that is on the upswing, or maybe even still going sideways before an upswing, and even how challenging it is to join something sort of late cycle. Like I got into the space at the sort of middle of the last major bull cycle, and you know the people who are joining in and building relationships and connections with each other at that stage are really there because there's money and because for that investment or speculation aspect. But the people who are actually driving innovation and who are actually creating value and who are ultimately, luckily being able to realize a lot of that value, they were there years before or months before. And so I think like for folks that are listening to this right now, like it might feel like all the opportunity, you see all this data about NFT volumes being down and all sorts of like really like stark reasons as to why like a whole lot of money is leaving the space. But what will sort of persist, and should you be able to continue to dedicate time into the space, those relationships that are ultimately going to be your next co-founder, or your next early project that you're in, your next first mint, are going to be coming through that network that you're building or solidifying in the times when, people just throwing spaghetti at the wall and being like, yo, look at that spaghetti. It kind of looks like Kermit the Frog. That's kind of cool. Like, let's go see what that is. And the reality is most of the stuff would fail, but like the risk of failure is just so much lower because nobody's paying attention anyways. And so those are, I think, some of the interesting dynamics that kind of come out of it.
And I think to that point, you used to just draw Kermit the Frog and be able to raise a $20 million seed round. Now I think the bar is much higher, the cost of capital is much higher, that washes away the people who just come in for a quick buck. You're going to need to spend months building a product, building a community before you're even able to go to market to start fundraising capital. And so I think that's kind of washed away the people who are in for the quick buck and have brought in and motivated those who are in it for the long haul and who want to build long-term value. And I also think we're seeing really talented people who were maybe attracted by the meteoric growth in Web3 in 2021, but who are maybe now just joining, really talented entrepreneurs, builders, operators from Web2 who are now in Web3 and are building real excellent use cases and are adopting this tech. So I'm excited for those people to be here in this moment of building.
I think we're still a little ways out from seeing most of that sort of speculative fervor disappear from the space. I think there's still a lot of first-time bear market journeyers right now that haven't fully been able to identify what the modern reality of it, or at least the contemporary reality, of lack of money and of, treasuries running out and of companies failing. So I think we still have a ways to go, but yeah, I totally agree. The talent is here. There's more money than ever. There's more use cases than ever. There's more tools than ever. The infrastructure is growing. I found myself in a couple conversations, even speaking with Steve, whose episode's going to drop this week, talking about the conviction in crypto. And it's funny how that is never even something I even think about anymore. There isn't this debate in my mind about it. It's not if, it's kind of where and when, which I think is a thing that when I looked at folks who I very much looked up to and relied upon for early support within C Club, and to see that strength of conviction that they had, even though it's just been 3 years of not a whole lot happening, and trying to wonder okay, where does that conviction come from? Well, it comes from being through it once before or twice before or 3 times before. I understand there's a lot of people that are new into the communities that are really trying to wrap their head around this, but I'm almost over this conversation of how do you survive the bear market? Yeah, you're going to have to grind and you have to innovate. And, if we go back to our earliest part of the conversation, why am I so bullish on communities over any other type of social tokens? Because these are the sort of entities of which creativity and mutual support and innovation can kind of manifest and be realized. We haven't had to see a whole lot of that over the last little while. And yet I think the strongest projects that are coming out of this phase are ones who have really internalized that and are saying, okay, sure, we had a starting point, but this is just a starting point. We play the game to get to where we are today, but the hard work is still to come. And then I think about the value of compounding just generally, that I think so many of us have a hard time really wrapping our heads around. And when you add on just incredible short-term incentives in crypto, it becomes really tough to think about what long-term compounding might even look like. But if you zoom out 2 years, you start to see compounding user growth, and you start to see when I bought Ethereum the first time, it went from $7 to $14 and I sold half of it. I was like, hell yeah, that was amazing. I mean, it's sitting at $1,000, $1,100 right now. Couldn't even fathom what that would look like. And is everything going to do that? Hell no, most isn't. But
every bad decision I've ever made was a short-term one, I'm going to make this trade, right? I'm going to sell these tokens and then I'm going to buy back lower or whatever it may be, or I'm going to buy now. It's going to go up a little bit more and I'll sell. And when I was purely playing the crypto make money game, you get burned more often. The best investments I made were just buying BTC and ETH and not touching it, putting it in a cold wallet and just hiding it. So I think I agree with you. It's we know what it's going to take to survive. Crypto is going to survive. New use cases are going to pop up. The best projects are going to keep building heads down. Doesn't matter where we're at in the market. There's no reason to get too bogged down in prices, because the whole world's in a tough moment. And I think it's not crypto in particular.
You were a really early contributor to C Club and came through I remember back in the day we were thinking about DAO onboarding. And I just kind of laugh and think about how you and Nicole just kept showing up and kept doing things. And then it was kind of you're onboarded type thing even before. So it was just such a more emergent thing. And now we have whole product categories that are focused on this. I wonder if you wanted to just zoom out a little bit and think about maybe some of your early beliefs around how to operate in this sort of DAO or community token space versus the beliefs you have now that you've been in it and been deeply involved in day-to-day operations of a growing organization like C Club?
Yeah, I'd say like the number one skill has been just to be comfortable in gray space and not having clarity, and just your North Star always being just get things done and execute. You could have an inclination that the direction you're going in and focusing on is the right path, but you won't really know until you go out and do it. So I think none of us are really experts. None of us have spent 15 years in building tokenized communities. We're all like maybe max 3-4 years of participating in this area of crypto. So I think that people just get hung up on not having relevant knowledge or whatever it may be. And the reality is this area of the internet just needs people who are going out and doing things. It could be things just outside of your comfort zone, coordinating a conference or an in-person event, or taking notes in a meeting, or volunteering to figure out DAO taxes and corporate structuring. And there's a lot of gray space out there. And so I think those who've been able to find their footing have just gone out and done tasks to try and get to as close as you can to a solution. I think that's part of the beauty of it. It's like, if you figure it out, like even 90% accuracy, like you're far ahead of everyone else. And then you kind of become this de facto expert in that area. And then you keep getting smarter and smarter and push to the edges of that particular problem. And that's what excites me. It's like developing specialty knowledge of these little areas and then kind of stacking those little skills on top of each other until you have such a unique skill set that no one else in the world can replicate it. It's like you're like, okay, I am a DAO legal expert who has a history of working in e-commerce, who can also speak Japanese. And then like you combine those like things and you're the one person in the world who like could deliver on a product that needs someone with that esoteric skill set. And obviously that's an extreme example, but I do think like that's what's fun. And like you're not really pigeonholed into any specific thing. You can go also work for another DAO and tap in there, or join a different working group in a DAO. So being comfortable experimenting in the gray space and then stacking these little pieces of knowledge, I think is what makes this all fun.
What do you think some of the things that C Club has gotten wrong over the year plus that you've sort of been contributing? Like what are those what are those lessons? Because I think to your point, like so much of this is emergent and imperfect. And I often kind of laugh when people are like, oh, eventually this is all going to be a template and figured out. And what's the value of C Club in a world where all these things are figured out? I'm like, the closer you are to thinking you figured that out, the further away you realize you are from those answers. But I'm curious what your answer to like, what do you think we've gotten wrong and had to learn from?
I think this is a contrarian take. I think DAOs, like when I first heard of them, I thought it was going to be flat and everyone and it's true, like everyone has like a voice and an opinion, but I do think leadership matters. And I think like leaning into your leadership, leaning into Nicole's leadership, like that has propelled us in order to move faster and to break things and to make decisions and work efficiently and effectively. And that's one thing that I think we were originally trying to be. Like just, it just slows things down. You need like somebody helping shape thought and push directions and figure out where the edges are that we want to play in. So that was one thing that I feel like I've learned and I find very fascinating. Where have we messed up? I think DAO operations are very hairy, and building structure earlier, I think would have been, you kind of have to go through these mistakes in order to come out to the other side. So I think like baking in goals and milestones and, trying to quantify those goals. I know people like look at Web2 and traditional organizations and they say like KPIs and OKRs and they like shudder because, they never want to go back to a world where that is. And I'm not saying we should, but having some direction, some action and accountability are things that we were slow in officially adopting. And I think that's all part of the process. But now that we're in that frame of mind, it provides clarity for everyone. And knowing like where to go after, where to spend your time, what qualifies as success for me personally as a contributor. Like not having that clarity isn't good for the other members of the DAO or for me personally, putting my contributor hat on. So I'd say like definitely thinking through like organizational structure early in the game before you're playing catch up and you have organizational debt to work through, I think is important. There's never ending challenges that come up, but I think having that clarity enables people to tap in and go solve problems.
That's well said. I think the way I was framing is like, we don't need a leader, we need more leaders. But there's also like this inherent issue in all DAOs of information asymmetry. And it takes time to break that down for any new contributor. You just join a Discord and you try to figure out what the hell's going on. It's like going to be an uphill battle regardless. The further involved you are in these organizations, the more complexities there are and the more decisions that have been made that even if they are captured, the context around them can be kind of difficult. And so, and then even, trying to spin out working groups that are, our working groups have autonomous budgets, and those budgets are being voted on by our DAO members. We kind of lacked that specificity around like what good looks like there, and the last mile work to actually start to shape and help those teams say no and focus on what to say yes to. Yeah, I think it just led to a lot of people spinning unnecessary stress on things that could have really been solved by a more direct conversation. The starting point is still new, right? Like, we want to make it accessible for people to have their voice heard and to participate and to contribute and to have an impact on what those things are. But in no way can you go do all of them. And so there needs to be some filtering and decisions at some level. The longer we go to actually put in the process around how we come up with those filters and decisions and how do we improve them and measure them, the more people run around with like a chicken with their head cut off, which I think is in many ways one of the benefits of DAOs, and that people are running around and bouncing off new things, and that's great. But oh man, constraints really are freeing. And there's that old adage that clarity is kindness. And I think that can be a very difficult thing for many organizations. And I don't think that this is sort of a binary thing where it's like, it's either like a startup and a small team that's executing, or it's a DAO that's flat and everybody has an equal say. I know there are numbers of folks out there that are trying to sort of paint the world like that, but I think there's a lot of in between, and we can still really lean into like the underlying tenets of governance and ownership and exit and still get into a much better place. To get there, we still need to be supported by more structure. And of course, I think the other thing I would say to answer my own question is like, so many folks just feel like we need to reinvent the wheel all the time. And like, there is just such a wealth of experience and knowledge in the field of self-management that would have saved us all this time of being like, well, maybe groups should set their own KPIs and they should bubble up into some broader sort of narrative. And doing that in a self-managed team is just different, and it's difficult, but it's not new. People have walked that path before. And so, I think like the sexiness of DAOs comes from trying to say, hey, everything is brand new and we're going to go build this all together. But the practicality is that people have done this before, and there's so many difficult things for us to go do. Why would we try to reinvent something that has already been proven to work somewhere else? And yet we fall down that path, like into that challenge fairly regularly in a whole bunch of unsuspecting ways.
And I'd say like, there's definitely the concern that putting in that structure, that organization, those tried frameworks into this world, like people want to rebel against it. But I don't think that sacrifices experiments. It actually just provides a safe space for those experiments to take place. Like you can go out, say you want to think about compensation in a way that's not skeuomorphic. You could go spin up a working group you're going to explore different frameworks for compensating contributors and a native token and USDC and some combination of the two, and leveraging tools like Coordinate, whatever it may be. But I think like there needs to be structure around how those experiments are run. And I think there's a lot of precedent for that, and we shouldn't be shy of using those tried and true methods.
One of the things at C Club that we sort of identified early on was that it's like, it's so easy to mint a token. Like the actual creation of a token is not the difficult thing whatsoever, but it's like, how do you actually create value that gets represented by that token? And I think NFTs are the best example of this, right? Like anybody can go create, I wonder how many millions of different NFTs that are out there that nobody really cares about. But what matters is like they start to get value when people understand the playing field that they're playing on, and what the pieces represent and what the rules are. And out in like a broad open landscape of nothingness, it's really hard to start to figure out what you should do next or why something might be valuable or how to create value there. But within on a soccer pitch or within, the art blocks ecosystem or within a 10K PFP, like all of a sudden these rules start to be identified and people start to have, and all of a sudden all new innovation starts to stack on top of that. And so I think that's like an absolute essential piece to all this sort of stuff is that there needs to be rules. And there's a great book called Finite and Infinite Games, which really just talks about thinking thoughtfully about what the rules that we can create are, such that we continue to perpetuate the ability for us to play this game. And I think that's really what I come back to when I think about the importance of bringing in structure into these organizations and being thoughtful about culture early on. Is that it's one thing to want to be able to play and experiment in the short term, but we're trying to create institutions that last. Creating structure so that we can increase our likelihood of success just seems like an absolute no-brainer. And yet, I think so much of sort of experimenting in the space, because it is so easy and there are a ton of benefits that come with it, are being done in ways that really aren't being super pragmatic and thoughtful and long-term minded.
Yeah, I think it's like, you pop into a DAO and you see how things are done there. Like there's a way how things are done in this DAO. We have our rules, like our morals, our ethics, our values. I think like you need to establish those. And I was listening to the Mark Zuckerberg interview with Tim Ferriss, and I had never really heard Zuck be so candid. And what I thought it was interesting when he was revealing the new values that they were revealing at Meta. And what I thought he said were interesting. It's like it can only be a value if it's devaluing something counter. Like it needs like just how you, if you have a thesis, there needs to be able to have a counter thesis. And so he's like, you should be able to debate this value. And they are making deliberate value choices that, ruthless experimentation, I think was one of them. It was like iterating quickly. And that may mean that, there's some things that break in the process. But that's a conscious decision they're making. And I think DAOs should, and communities need to really like put a stake in the sand. And maybe that's a community who comes up with that. But like, this is how things are done over here. Like, this is like where we, like what our North Star is. Like we align by these principles.
Yeah, I think there's like a big opportunity for people, for another organization or for consultants or individuals to play that role in early DAOs. If I wasn't doing the privilege of being able to work at C Club, I think that's a place that I'd be really fascinated with, because it is such high impact and yeah, it seems to be very missing from most of these early conversations.
Seems like there's basic like community guidelines, like no cursing or like something like that. But defining the culture and those values is something I'm excited to see more of.
What are DAOs good for or good at?
I think DAOs really get people excited on a particular mission, right? Like it's like you always say, it's like the call to adventure. The fact that anyone around the world can tap into this, like it's almost like an extracurricular. It's like, oh, I want to be on the basketball team, or I'm really excited by debate or Model UN. Like I think about these like high school examples, and you can find like what you're excited by and tap into it. And maybe you're tapping in just on a part-time after work perspective first, in which case there is a space for you. And then maybe over time, you're so excited by this and this new paradigm to explore this mission that you could become full-time. And I think like that is so like just being able to tap into any mission adventure is just exciting. Like I have the world at my fingertips. I can go find a community or DAO that is trying to solve literally any problem on Earth or in any vertical that I'm fascinated by. And the fact that I can just find that so accessibly, hop in, start supporting it, learn, and maybe even get paid, that's pretty cool.
I like that answer. I think Alex Larson from Blockchain Capital asked me this question the other day, and my mind was very much in like I think my answer was really around like allocating capital. And then I was sort of like, wait, is that true? I like your answer better, because I think the jury is still out on how effective these DAOs can be at actually allocating capital. I always have nouns top of mind. And really like that is one of the big innovations there, is just saying, well, all that our token holders really get to figure out is like, how do we deploy our treasury to further the meme of nouns? Broad, simple, clear on-chain expectations. But also there's still like a whole pile of cash sitting there in their treasury and can they actually deploy it at a velocity that actually has impact, and can they measure that impact, and can they get better at deploying, and does that actually get easier as new members join, or does that get more difficult as new members join? And so I think like there's still like a lot of open questions there. I think we've seen it work in investing DAOs, like this idea of deploying capital. But again, we haven't seen that over many, many cycles.
Will nouns be able to execute on some of the proposals that come forth, like launching a nouns glasses brand? I think that's going to be the question as well, is like, not only are they thoughtfully allocating capital, but is there enough skin in the game and time and effort that will come from nouns contributors to actually deliver on those projects?
Yeah, and I think that their answer there would be, well, we're going to go choose a team that can go deliver on these projects. But then the question is like not just allocating capital, but choosing the right team and then making sure that the incentives flow back. And so I think, yeah, the point is real. But I do think like, I mean, I think back on some of these words that we started to use that are being just used across the space right now. I think about the title that I chose early on for myself as instigator, and seeing everybody and their dog call themselves an instigator, I think is fascinating. This idea of the call to adventure, though, I think is one that is really, I need to probably write something about this, because it's to me is very different than the BHAG or than a mission or a vision. And what it's talking about is exactly what you're talking about here. This idea that people want to be a part of something that has the potential for immense success and also the risk of abject failure. And maybe all of those sort of bundled into 2-week sprints, such that you're sort of building, connections with your travel mates and learning about each other, learning about yourselves, trying to have an impact on the world, maybe succeeding that, maybe not, but the entire bundle of everything together becomes the interesting part. So yeah, I think like, are we good at allocating capital? I hope we get better at it. I think there's that's very much a really interesting piece, but this idea of like broad international participation and ownership and membership, I think is like the thing. And even like I mentioned as an example of like, I was on a panel in New York and people were asking like, what's a good example of a DAO that you should pay attention to? And I really try not to shill all the C Club DAOs there, and how do I choose from all these wonderful projects that we get to work with. And so I mentioned Gitcoin as just a great example of a DAO that is dealing with challenges. But, you look at the scale and attention of people who are buying into this meme of wanting to support the funding of public goods. And I think really what that is an example of what you're saying here. Like there's a very worthwhile mission and adventure for people to go on. We still do not know how to do it well. There's tons of stuff to figure out, but there's a reason why it's probably the number 1 or 2 most joined snapshot space. If you look at snapshots, just I think behind ENS. People care about it, and maybe that's enough for right now.
People like to gnaw on hard problems, and I think like being able to tap into an area that they're fascinated by and find a problem and try and solve it with other like-minded people is exciting. And I think DAOs unlock that and create infinite experiments and calls to adventures. And I hope that never changes. And I hope we see more and more wacky and weird experiments, and that, I think that we'll start to see a number of those really catch fire and then almost become like a black hole in just attracting people to it. And it's like, how big could this really get? If you look at one like Cabin or even Seed Club as an example, it's like, if Seed Club like continues and like there are more and more projects that enter into its orbit, and like there's more and more value being created and the projects are successful, it's like, how large can this, this gravitational pull of Seed Club become? And I think people get like pumped on that mission. And, it's cool. Like it's cool to see a community that you're involved with online, like attract attention from people, like going to a bar. And like, I remember I was in the Caribbean for a wedding, and like 3 or 4 people were wearing Pool Suite hats. And I was like, holy shit. Like, you guys all know about Pool Suite? Like, I love Pool Suite. Like, Marty's amazing. Like, it's cool. Like when like you're seeing like your little niche area in the internet start to catch fire and the people take notice.
Is there anything that you want to draw attention to, or that maybe we didn't get into?
Yeah, in 30 seconds, and then I'll do the same. What's your most contrarian take right now?
I think DAOs might be more about leverage than about scale. The idea that DAOs need to be 1,000, 100,000, million people to really truly have, massive impact might be incorrect, and that, like software, maybe smaller, more focused organizations making use of these incredible composable tools will actually be some of the most valuable organizations in the world. How about you?
Shouldn't have asked that question because I don't have a good answer lined up. Uh,
That's fine. Let's leave it there.
yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah. Oh, I'll give one. I'll give one quick attempt. I personally, like, I know everyone's terrified of like the SEC and all of this being deemed securities, and like all this could be taken away from us like that. And I frankly like cannot wait for regulation and like some clarity, because I'm so long human ingenuity and creativity that like once we have some clarity and we know the lines that we can draw in, people are going to build some amazing shit within those lines. So I'm excited for that.
+1 to that. Just draw the playing field and let people have fair and open access to it. And I think the space will be better off.
Amen.
All right, Ben. Well, appreciate you hanging out, man.
Thank you, Jess.